Welcome to the second episode in our video series about the Founding Fathers of the United States of America. Now, this video series is not some boring recitation of dusty old facts. No. We are going to have some fun here. So we are going to consider the context at the time and the situations that confronted our founding fathers. And we'll understand what they believed and what they did. So this is going to give us a great sense of who these founding fathers really were. As people, as human beings, we are going to get to know them. And along the way, we are also going to get a wonderful sense of the fascinating story of the founding of this nation. So let's pick up our story where we left off as we stand right here in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So in the first video, we started our big board. So we've got this big board going here that is going to help us keep track of the central founding fathers that we are learning about here in this video series. So in the first episode, we were introduced to George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. And at the end of that first video, we ended with the American Revolutionary War. So we saw how George Washington, leading the Continental Army, had just won the American Revolutionary War and had just kicked out England. So let's pick up the story there and jump right into episode 2. Now, many people think that that was it. That was the end. You know, that the American Revolutionary War happened. America was established. That's the America that we have today, and the rest is history. But no. That is not how it happened. So what happened here is, after the war was won, Britain was kicked out, but that left the 13 independent colonies. It was not clear at all what these 13 independent colonies were going to do. Okay, it wasn't clear how they were going to govern themselves. Okay, they were just left with 13 independent colonies. Here is a look at the 13 original colonies that became the 13 original states. So you've got states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York and Massachusetts. So these were 13 independent states. Okay, there was no federal government, there was no central government. It was just these 13 independent states. So, if you think about it, you think about what George Washington did at the end of the war. Because George Washington, if anybody was sort of the central figure of a national government, it was George Washington, because that was really the event that brought these 13 independent colonies together. Was, hey, let's join together to engage in this war against Britain. So that was like the one endeavor that was national. So what happened at the end of the war? What does Washington do with this, national federal army? Washington voluntarily quits. Okay, he resigns his military commission. He steps down, disbands the army. All of these soldiers go back to their individual states. And Washington himself goes into retirement, returns to his estate in Virginia, and retires. Okay, now this actually was an extraordinary event in history. In fact, it's one of the greatest events in world history. Why? Because Washington was in the perfect position to seize power for himself, right? He was the head of the army, and he had just won this war, kicked out Britain. He's basically in the perfect position to take over control of this new nation for himself, and nobody could challenge him, because if anybody tried to challenge him, he was the head of the army. He could crush them. Okay, so if you look back in world history, people who are in this position, stepped up and seized power for themselves. And this happened all around the world, all throughout history. Think of Napoleon in France. or Fidel Castro in Cuba, leading these military, battles. And when they win, they then seize control of the entire state, and then they stay in power for as long as they can. And this happened throughout history in, Europe and South America and in Africa, all over the world. Okay, so this was an extraordinary event. In fact, when the King of England is told that Washington was going to step down, he couldn't believe it. Okay, this was King George III. Now, this was the guy, King of England, who had just lost the American colony on his watch while he was king. Okay, that's a bummer. Imagine if that were you. If you were King of England, England basically founded, the America and these colonies, developed them and owned them for, some 170 years, and then on King George's watch, he loses them. That's a bummer for King George. But so King George is informed that Washington is going to step down from power. He can't believe it. King George III, he's stunned. He can't believe it. And he remarks, if Washington does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Okay? That signifies how extraordinary this was, that Washington voluntarily relinquishes power. But that is what Washington does. He resigns his commission, disbands the army, and goes back to Virginia. So there's no federal army. This just shows there's no central government. There's no federal government. There's no United States of America. So what is it? It is just 13 independent states that view themselves as sovereign, separate states. And people refer to them as such. So, including the founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson would refer to Virginia as his country. Okay, my country, Virginia. It wasn't my country, the United States, or my country, the United States of America, or America. No. It was my country, Virginia. Okay, so people thought of this as these 13 states were independent, sovereign nations of themselves. Okay, it was very much like Europe. So here's a map of Europe, and you can see the individual nations of Europe. So you can see, like, here is England, and here is France, and here's Spain, and here's Italy. See the boot of Italy with the heel of the boot down here. So each of these countries was its own separate independent nation. They did not come together and form the United States or a United States. Now, you might be thinking of the European Union, and it's true, they did do that much later. I mean, this is only in contemporary times. In fact, it was largely based upon the model of the United States. Right? So Europe said, wow, the United States is so successful because they all came together and formed a union, that we should do the same thing. But that was only in the contemporary times of today. Back then, however, and throughout history, each of these territories was its own separate nation. Spain, France, Italy, its own separate nation. But if you think about it, they're also very much like states, right? France is very much like a state, and Spain is like a state, Italy is like a state, and you could see them that they could have come together and formed a United States. In fact, let's take this map of Europe and let's superimpose it onto the map of the United States. So that's what we have here. So the background you can see is the United States, and the colored area is Europe sort of superimposed right on top of the United States. It's a little bit hard to make out, but you can kind of get the idea. So this is England, and then France is here, and Spain is here, and Italy is here. You can see the boot of Italy with the heel of the boot down here. So it's very similar to the United States in that, France could have been a state and Spain could have been a state, and they could have formed the United States of Europe. But they didn't. Their model was that they all remained separate independent nations. France, Spain, Italy, London, separate independent nations. So that is what the original 13 states were thinking. Okay, they were thinking along the European model, which is they would remain independent nations. So when they won the American Revolutionary War and kicked out England, they said, woohoo, we're free. So Virginia said, I'm now my own free nation of Virginia. Sort of like Virginia would be like France. And Pennsylvania said the same thing. I'm my own independent nation of Pennsylvania. Sort of like Italy. And New York said the same thing. I'm my own independent nation of New York. Sort of like England, right? So each of the separate 13 states was thinking of themselves as a separate sovereign entity. these 13 states are thrilled that they have gotten rid of this tyrannical monarchy from the English crown, and they're like, woohoo, we're all free, we're all free, we're all free states. So that's how it went. Okay, so for after the revolution, these states were operating as free, separate, independent states under this loose rubric of the Articles of Confederation. But pretty soon, problems started to arise, right? You started to have more and more problems that under this Articles of Confederation that they just weren't working. Okay, so like what? Why was it that these Articles of Confederation weren't working? What were the problems? So there were a whole number of problems. So a few of them were, so for example, there was no federal government that could raise money, that could tax all of the states and raise money. So one of the problems was they couldn't pay off the war debt. So the Revolutionary War, they just won. When they kicked out Britain, they incurred debts for that, right? One of the debts was paying the soldiers. Okay, the soldiers that fought in this war, they were still owed all this money, for their back pay that they never got, and there was no way to raise the money. So what some people were saying is we need to be able to tax all the states, a federal tax, because look, we're all free now. We all benefited from this. So there should be a federal government that can tax all the states so we can pay these war debts, pay the soldiers, and pay, companies who contributed, arms and ammunition and uniforms and stuff. The government had all these debts from the war. So this actually had a lot of support behind it, and under the Articles of Confederation, the 13 states came together, and all but one, so 12 out of the 13 states agreed that this was a good idea. So what they said was, look, we're going to allow the federal government to tax, but only for this purpose, just to pay off these debts. So all you people out there who are paranoid about the federal government raising taxes, don't worry, it's only to pay off these debts. But one state said no. And that state was Rhode Island. Okay, Rhode Island said no. And under the Articles of Confederation, it required a unanimous vote, right? It required 100%. So if even one state didn't agree, then the measure couldn't pass, it was dead. And that's what Rhode Island did. They killed this measure. So it's kind of funny. Rhode Island actually has a funny history in this, because over and over and over again, when there was this increasing movements or initiatives to try to come together and create some sort of central government or to unify the states, Rhode Island was always just saying no. It's actually pretty funny. So Rhode Island killed this measure. So the federal government couldn't raise any money. That was one problem. Couldn't raise money. Another problem was it couldn't raise an army. This was exactly what George Washington experienced when he was head of the Revolutionary Army. He couldn't get money and men to fight this army. Well, now here we are after the war is over, right? And sometimes you need some sort of military force, but there was no way to do it because the federal government couldn't raise money, couldn't raise an army. So you had a number of situations so one example was Britain. So even though Britain lost the war and Britain got kicked out of America, and even under the terms of surrender, Britain agreed to surrender certain areas, there were a few forts in the Northwest Territory where Britain refused to go. Okay, even though they agreed, they were violating their treaty and they refused to go. So they had soldiers there and they were arming Indians, and there were skirmishes and they had boundary disputes and they were creating all sorts of problems. But there was nothing that the 13 states could do about it because they couldn't raise an army. There was no federal army. They had no way to do it. So there was nothing they could do about it. Okay, and they had a similar problem down in New Orleans. So on the southern end of what is today the United States, you had Spain, and Spain began to block off all access in the port of New Orleans. And this is huge because the port of New Orleans is basically the mouth of the entire Mississippi River, where that flows into the ocean, and then from the ocean you can export or import goods. So it was huge for trade. So Spain starts excluding these 13 states from being able to access the port of New Orleans. This was a huge problem too for the 13 states, but there was nothing they could do about it because, again, they had no army. Okay, amazing. So one reason to have an army is to be able to defend yourself against actions that foreign countries are taking against you. But the United States was helpless. Another reason to have some sort of foreign army or police force is not only just for foreign powers, but also for internal problems. So internal, like riots or internal rebellions, or quelling your own citizens if your citizens rise up. Okay, so you had a few of these situations as well. So shortly after the Revolutionary War ended, 1783, you had a rebellion, and this was in Pennsylvania. So you had people that were in western Pennsylvania, and they were former soldiers. So they had just fought in the Revolutionary War under George Washington, and they were not paid, right? Because these soldiers hadn't been paid. So they were upset about not being paid. So what did they do? They banded together, they grabbed their guns, and they started marching over to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was the place where the Continental Congress was meeting. So they were going to march into Philadelphia armed, and they were going to demand that Congress pay their past salaries. Okay, now this seems to make a lot of sense, but if you're Congress, you can't pay it because you don't have the money, and you don't have the ability to raise money on a federal basis because there's no central government. And you also don't have an army to protect yourself, to defend yourself if you're Congress from these people who are marching onto Congress. So what did Congress do? They fled. They ran away. So Congress fled out of Philadelphia to Princeton, New Jersey, where they reconvened temporarily because they were worried about this, these citizens who were basically marching on into Philadelphia. Okay, so this was another reason that led people to think, look, we need some sort of a central government here. This is, we can't have this. We can't have citizens marching on Congress, right? It is crazy. So another example occurred a few years later. So this was known as Shays' Rebellion. And this occurred in 1786 and 1787. And it was very similar to what occurred in Pennsylvania, although this occurred up in Massachusetts. So what happened was, again, it was these soldiers, these former soldiers who fought under George Washington in the Revolutionary War. They then went back to their small farms, and their small farms were, not doing so well because they were gone. They were off fighting the war, the Revolutionary War. So now they returned to their small farms. So they're not doing very well, but nonetheless, they still have to pay taxes on their land, and they had some debts, and they had to pay their lenders. So when they couldn't pay because they didn't receive their payments, their salaries, their past salaries from being a soldier, so they had no money to pay their taxes with. So what happened when they couldn't pay their taxes and their debts? Their land started being foreclosed. Okay, so the government started foreclosing and taking away their lands, and these banks foreclosing and taking away their lands. Okay, so this has these former soldiers in outrage. So they then band together, grab arms, and they begin to march. So they march largely on government buildings. They start taking over government buildings, start taking over courthouses. Okay, so when courthouses were going to, have a foreclosure proceeding to take away somebody's land, they burst in and they'd, take over the courthouse and stop the foreclosure proceeding. Okay. But this rebellion began to get out of hand. It was growing, it was getting bigger and bigger, and they were causing more and more damage, and they began engaging in vandalism, and they were smashing the property of merchants, and they were taking wealthy merchants hostage and their family members hostage, and people were dying, and it was becoming a problem, a riot, like chaos, anarchy. But there was nothing the federal government could do because there was no federal government, and there was no federal army, there was no federal power. No one could come in and step in and stop this. It was a real problem. So this is another reason that people started thinking, listen, we need some sort of central government here in order to, maintain the peace and maintain order and justice here. So that was a reason why, things weren't working under the Articles of Confederation. Another reason was interstate trade. So you had the trade of goods between the two states, or among the 13 states, and they were trading goods back and forth with each other. So they started fighting with each other. So what happened was when one state would manufacture goods and then transport them across the border into another state, that other state would say, hey, wait a minute, this is competition against our manufacturers. We want to, make goods. So what they would do is they would impose tariffs or taxes on goods that were coming in from other states to make those more expensive if they were being, imported from other states, even if it was just a neighboring state. And it was cheaper for the people to make them in their own state. So that favored their own manufacturing in their own states. Well, then the states started retaliating against each other. Well, if you're going to impose a tax against me for importing these goods, then I'm going to impose a tax against you for importing those goods. And pretty soon the states were in trade wars with each other, right? Where they're just increasing these taxes on all sorts of goods, and it became very hard to trade goods back and forth across state lines. So people are thinking, this is not good. We're better if we can, trade goods more freely, right? So this was another problem that was arising under these, state that were trying to be separate as opposed to, under some sort of a central government. And another reason was these individual states started issuing their own currency, right? So they were issuing their own money. Okay, among these individual states. And look, if you're an individual state, it makes sense, right? Because you view yourself as this sovereign nation. And if you're a sovereign nation, you should be able to issue your own money. Well, this was creating all sorts of problems because, $1 issued in one state, and you had another different kind of a dollar issued in another state. Were they worth the same amount? Yes or no, I don't know. And so you had all of this, there was no good way for determining it, whether they were equivalent in value. So you had these exchange rates that were fluctuating wildly, and there was no way to maintain an even currency, without one national currency. So again, it was a big problem. So there were all these problems that were occurring under this sort of loose affiliation with these separate states. So as a result of this, a number of people, it started gaining momentum that people were thinking, look, we need to come together and form some sort of a more centralized government that has some powers. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, obviously they should form a central government, right? Obviously. And if you think about the history of the United States, knowing what we know now, it makes perfect sense, right? Because, the federal government is what enabled the United States to rise to a world power. It's because we all unified together and united together. Okay, so you might be thinking to yourself, obviously they should form together. But it wasn't obvious at the time, and there were a number of reasons why people didn't want to do it. And why? Why would someone not want to, do this obvious solution? And the reason was because if you are an individual state, in order to create a federal government or centralized government, that means that the individual state would have to give up some of its power, would have to give up some of its power to the centralized government. Okay, so this was giving up its sovereign authority. Okay, and the reason that it had to give up its power, because that's the whole purpose of a federal government, meaning the whole purpose is if that states don't want to do something, if the state and the federal government disagree, the whole framework of a federal government is that the federal government wins. Okay, so if there is a dispute, the federal government wins. So if you're a state and you're giving up this power, that means that the federal government can tell you what to do. And that's why states didn't want to do it, right? As states were like, no, I don't want to give up my sovereign authority. I'm my own state. I want to make my own decisions, okay? And this is the exact reason that we kicked out Britain, right? This is the reason we kicked out the British monarchies, because we didn't want the British monarchy telling us what to do as the state of, say, Virginia or South Carolina, right? So South Carolina was saying, I don't want to create some new federal government that's basically the same as the British government. So no, this is why the individual states were resisting the call to create a federal government. This is a huge central issue. It's a huge fundamental issue. It was a huge issue back then for our founding fathers, but it is a huge issue today. It remains an issue today in this very country, in the United States. It is remarkable. And the issue is the correct balance between the balance of power between a federal government and the individual state governments. Who should have the most power, and how should that power be allocated? It remains a central issue to this day. In fact, you hear politicians talking about it all the time. In every election, presidential elections, Senate elections, congressional elections, local elections, even when there are no elections, politicians talk about it. So whenever you hear a politician talking about big government, right, or railing against big government, government's not the solution, big government's a problem, all that, it's the exact same issue. It goes back to this issue that the founding fathers were wrestling with back at this time, whether to create a federal government. You hear it in all sorts of ways. States' rights. Whenever you hear about states' rights, that's what this means. That people are arguing that the states should have more rights, they should have more power, and the federal government should have less power. When you hear politicians say, I don't want some bureaucrat off in Washington telling me how to run my state, it's the exact same issue. Okay, what they're saying is we want our state to have more rights, and we don't want the federal government, some bureaucrat in Washington, having power. That means the federal government has more power. It is a huge issue. It remains a huge issue to this day, and is one of the fascinating elements about this nation. Now, it is a huge issue not only for America, not only for our founding fathers back then, and not only for America today, but it is a huge issue around the world, and you see it in all sorts of areas. So you see it, for example, in the European Union is one example, the EU, right? They're basically operating under the equivalent of the Articles of Confederation. They have like a loose affiliation among their nation states, and they're trying to figure out what the right balance of power is. And they're always having problems about, states that are maybe going to leave and kicking out states, like kicking out Greece, and, England's talking about leaving. I mean, it's this big mess, and it's this big problem. Okay, so that's one example. Another example is, the trade agreements are another example. So, for example, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Under those agreements, the central issue is individual nations have to give up authority and recognize that a common authority among multiple nations will have authority over the individual nations to resolve issues of trade. You see this in the World Trade Organization as well, the WTO. Another area that you see it in is the United Nations, the UN, right? This is a body of all the countries around the world. They come together, but it doesn't really have a lot of power, right? There are a lot of instances where the United Nations cannot impose solutions on individual countries because individual countries do not want to give up their sovereignty to some international body. And the United States feels the same way. The United States is huge. In many respects, the United States refuses to give up its sovereign power, and it refuses to turn that over to some international body. It doesn't want to do that. The United States says, no, we are a sovereign country. We can make our own decisions for ourselves. We are not going to recognize some international body that can impose decisions upon us. It's the exact same issue that our founding fathers were dealing with when they were trying to create this nation. It's amazing. So you see it in globalization as well, right? I mean, the world is globalizing. Products are being made around the world, and the free flow of trade and capital is going on around the world. And it seems almost inevitable that where we're going to get at some point is that we are going to have some sort of worldwide body that governs us. And if you think about it, it makes sense because we're all human beings living on the same planet. If you think about it, drawing a borderline just between two countries is arbitrary. It doesn't make sense. We're all human beings living on the same planet. We should be able to get along with each other under some common framework instead of having separate frameworks that cause us to fight against each other. But individual nations do not want to give up their sovereignty, including the United States. So this idea of a common governing body seems to be a very long way off. But this is the exact same issue that our founding fathers were wrestling with back in this time period when they were trying to figure this out and create this nation. So back at the time, there was this growing sentiment of people recognizing that the Articles of Confederation were just not working, right? Because there was no central government that could raise money, that could raise an army. There was all these trade disputes among the individual states and creating their separate currencies. There are all these problems. So that led to this growing movement of more and more people realizing, what? We need to create some sort of a central federalized government. So a number of these people started to emerge as leaders in this movement to create a federal government. And one of those people was Alexander Hamilton. Now, this guy has an incredible background. In fact, his background is unlike any of these other central founding fathers here. In fact, Hamilton is sort of like, one of the first poster childs for the American dream. It's like a rags to riches story. Hamilton came from obscurity. He was like a nobody from nowhere, and he nonetheless rises to the pinnacle of government and becomes one of the leading founding fathers of the United States of America. It is a truly extraordinary story. So Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean. Okay, he wasn't even born in the United States or in America. Okay, so when he came to the United States, he was an immigrant. Okay, so he was not like a lot of these other founding fathers. So he was born in the Caribbean. He was born in Nevis, which at the time was a territory of the British Crown. So again, Hamilton was also born under the British Crown. He just wasn't born under the British Crown in America. He was born under the British Crown in the Caribbean. So the year of his birth is uncertain, actually. There is a discrepancy in the historical records on his birth. So it was either 1755 or 1757. One of those 2 years, not sure which. So he is born to, inauspicious circumstances. One of those circumstances is that he was actually born out of wedlock. Okay? Hamilton's parents were not married when Hamilton was born. Okay, so that makes Alexander Hamilton an illegitimate child. He was a bastard. Okay, now this was not a good thing, particularly back then, right? So this had all sorts of consequences and presented hardships for him. Like, one of the things was he couldn't get into the school that he wanted to go to. The main school said, "No, sorry, you're an illegitimate child. We cannot accept you." It's amazing. This guy had some difficult circumstances when he was a young child. So the story with his parents was that, so his mother, she was not wealthy at all. And his father, interestingly, actually had connections back to Scottish nobility. So his father's father was actually a nobleman in Scotland, and he was lower nobility. He wasn't senior nobility. He wasn't the king or in the king's court. Lower nobility, but nonetheless, they had they built this mansion, they had an estate, and that sort of thing. So Alexander Hamilton, on his father's side, he has genes. He traces up this lineage to Scottish nobility, which was interesting. So what happened was his mother, Alexander Hamilton's mother, she had been married previously, a prior marriage that had fallen apart, but she never got divorced. She never technically got divorced. So if you were a woman back then, in that day and age, you could not remarry unless you were divorced. So she didn't get that divorce. So she met Alexander Hamilton's father. They fell in love. They moved in together. They loved each other. They ended up having a couple of kids, including Alexander Hamilton. But this is why Alexander Hamilton was born out of wedlock. It's because his mother had a prior marriage and she never ended up getting divorced. So that was the situation as to why Alexander Hamilton was illegitimate. But at a very early age, Alexander Hamilton's father left. He abandoned the family. So that left Alexander Hamilton with his mother and his brother. But when Alexander Hamilton was a young man, they bounced around a little bit. They spent some time on St. Croix, which is another island in the Caribbean. But when Alexander Hamilton was very young, like 11 years old or 13 years old, his mother ended up getting a very severe fever, and she suddenly died. Okay? So this is, extremely difficult for Alexander Hamilton, extremely difficult childhood here. He's, born out of wedlock. His father abandons the family. His mother dies when he's young here. So he kicks around for a while. His cousin ends up taking him in for a while, but then his cousin commits suicide and he has nowhere to go. But Alexander Hamilton ended up getting this job with a merchant, a local merchant down here in the Caribbean who was dealing goods with America, which was still under British rule. And this merchant took him under his wing. Now, we see this over and over again with Hamilton. Hamilton was such an extraordinary person. He stood out to so many people that throughout his childhood and his young life, as he was rising up through the ranks in life, people recognized the extraordinary ability of Hamilton and they took him under their wing. And this happened over and over with Hamilton. It's amazing, and it really explained why he was able to rise so far so fast. So this was an example. So this merchant in the Caribbean, hires Alexander Hamilton to work in his business, but then he realizes, wow, this kid really has a lot of talent. So one of the things he would do, so pretty soon Alexander Hamilton became like the number one guy at this business, and he was just a young teenager. So when this merchant was off on voyages, he would leave the business in the hands of Alexander Hamilton because he was smart. He was good with numbers. He understood the business. He could write. He was an excellent writer. In fact, at an early age, this hurricane came through the Caribbean and hit the Caribbean, causing severe damage. And Alexander Hamilton, again, as a young teenager, wrote an account of the hurricane, what it was like, and it ended up getting published in a local newspaper, and it was an extremely popular account. So he had this amazing ability even as a child, as a young child. Right, so as a result of his abilities here, the merchant ended up taking him in, as well as employing him, took him in, and then the merchant and some other people around the community, the adults in the community, said, you know what, this kid Hamilton is so extraordinary that what we really need to do, we need to figure out a way to get him an education. It's like a waste. We're wasting his potential by having him just sit here on this island. We need to get him a formal education. So they ended up taking up a collection for Hamilton that gave them enough money to ship him to America for a formal education. This is what happened to Hamilton. This is how Hamilton ends up going from the Caribbean to America. So where do they send him in America? They send Alexander Hamilton to New York City, Manhattan. Okay, so Alexander Hamilton arrives in Manhattan. Now, think about this. When he arrives in Manhattan, first of all, he's young. He's like, 15 years old, something like that. He is an immigrant. He is an illegitimate child. And he has no family. He has no parents. His parents are dead. His father's gone. His father left the family. His mother is deceased. He's all by himself. He's got no family connections. I mean, it is extraordinary, this young kid. Okay, so here he is in New York City. So he ends up getting accepted into King's College for his education. Now, King's College is Columbia University today. So back then it was called King's College. So he gets accepted to King's College, and then he takes up with this professor. So again, this professor recognizes the ability of Alexander Hamilton. And indeed, Alexander Hamilton was extraordinary. He keeps, coming to the attention of people. And it's thought, some say, that of all the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton was the smartest by far. Like if they had standardized tests back then, Alexander Hamilton would have aced the test. He would have had the highest score on the test. He had this, great intellectual ability. So this professor takes Alexander Hamilton under his wing and he even gives him board. So Hamilton is living with this professor. Now, it turns out that this professor just so happens to have been involved in the movement towards revolution, towards independence, right? So he is involved in, believes that America should seek its independence from Britain. So this professor is a great influence on Hamilton, and Hamilton gets involved. So Hamilton now, he gets all excited about this revolution and seeking independence. And you think about it too, think about his perspective, right? Hamilton has just come from, this foreign country, the Caribbean. So he doesn't have any attachments to, the British crown here in America, or am I going to be a loyalist and all that. He comes to America, he's got this independent view, and he thinks, yeah, of course this should be an independent nation. That would be great. So Hamilton immediately becomes involved in this movement towards independence and towards revolution. So Hamilton sees his future as being in the revolutionary movement and even being in the Revolutionary War. But he starts writing these pamphlets. So he's working with this professor, he's in King's College, and he starts writing these pamphlets that are in favor of independence. And he writes them anonymously, it was a common practice at the time. And some of these pamphlets actually get published and are extremely popular. Okay, it's amazing. And the people who were reading them at the time thought that they were written by, real politicians and governors at the time. Little did they know that this was being written by a 17-year-old kid, Hamilton. Okay, it's amazing. But this is how smart this guy was, right? Intellectually, he was smart. He had ideas, but he also had the power of the pen. He was a great writer. He could write in an engaging way. So he's writing these pamphlets, but he sees that his future glory is in the army, as part of the revolution. Okay, so that's what he wants to do. So he and some of his college buddies here at King's College, they band together and they form a group of militiamen, and they end up joining a local militia, in New York City. So they end up, drilling and doing military exercises and practices, and firing their weapons and planning for charges and all that sort of stuff, to prepare for the Revolutionary War. And sure enough, the Revolutionary War starts to get underway. And he's a young guy here, he's in his early 20s. So once the war starts getting underway, Hamilton and his buddies, these young guys, they end up going down to the southern tip of Manhattan and conducting a raid on this British sort of storage location, and they end up stealing some cannons and some ammunition, which was a successful raid, right? It's pretty funny. So as a result of that, Hamilton actually gets put in charge of this little military unit in the militia, and he actually starts to fight. He actually sees some battles, some action in the early stages of the Revolutionary War. But again, Hamilton comes to the attention of more senior military officers, and they recognize his intellectual ability, and they say, look, this guy, he should be promoted, but he belongs up here in the administration of the war. People who are, thinking and planning and writing. He doesn't belong in the field, shooting guns. He belongs, in the administration and planning of this war. So they begin to try to get him to, be aides and that sort of thing to different commanders and that sort of thing. So, again, this is, Hamilton being recognized. But pretty soon, these people bring Hamilton to the attention of none other than George Washington. Okay. So this is the head of it all, George Washington, right? So they come to George Washington, they say, Washington, dude, you gotta get this Hamilton guy on your team. He's an amazing kid. I mean, he's super smart. You gotta get him as, being part of your administration here. So George Washington gives an offer to Alexander Hamilton to become one of Washington's aides. Extraordinary, amazing, right? So Hamilton, he's a little bit ambivalent because he sees his glory as being on the battlefield, but he also recognizes that, wait a minute, this is a pretty good opportunity to be an aide to the head of it all. Pretty good opportunity. So Hamilton agrees and he accepts. So Hamilton becomes an aide to George Washington, right? So this is an extraordinary rise. He's only in his early 20s, 21 years old, something like that. So I mean, just think of it. He just came to this country a few years ago, and again, immigrant, illegitimate child, no parents, no family, and now all of a sudden, a few years later, he is an aide to George Washington. So George Washington then recognizes this guy's ability, and he pretty soon promotes him to be one of his senior aides. So Hamilton becomes senior aide to George Washington in the Revolution, the American Revolution. So what does he do? He's doing all sorts of stuff. I mean, he's seeing everything from a bird's eye view from the very top spot, and he's doing a lot of writing for Washington because Hamilton's such a great writer. So he's writing orders and writing correspondence and that sort of thing. And then he starts interacting with the senior generals. So he's writing orders from Washington and delivering them to senior generals and interacting with the senior generals. So he pretty quickly becomes integrated into the administration and the running of this war with George Washington. Amazing, extraordinary. And pretty soon he's like signing his own, orders. So it was really extraordinary. So one of the things that Alexander Hamilton realizes in this position is that this is no way to run a government under this loose affiliation of these separate independent states under the Articles of Confederation. It's like, this is a disaster, right? This is the same thing that Washington had. Remember, Washington hated the Articles of Confederation because he couldn't raise money, he couldn't raise men, he couldn't get supplies, all that. Well, now Hamilton sees this as well because Hamilton is working elbow to elbow with George Washington. He sees this as well. He sees it's a disaster to not have a central government. You need a central government, right? Because he sees how all the struggles that Washington is having in trying to run this war. So this is a huge influence on Hamilton that sticks with him for the rest of his life. So it's amazing. So after the war, so the war ends, the colonists win their independence, the army disbands. So what happens to Hamilton? So Hamilton resigns his commission from the army, and he goes back to New York City, where he's from and where he lived, after he immigrated, and he becomes a delegate to Congress. So he gets appointed to this Congress, but it's still under the Articles of Confederation. But this is where he takes his experience from the war and he says, this whole system of government, this loose affiliation, is no good. So he becomes a leading voice in this movement to create some sort of a stronger, centralized federal government. So he is one of these strong advocates that we've got to create a federal government. So let's put our boy Alexander Hamilton here up on the big board. Like Hamilton, there were a number of other leading voices that emerged to advocate for the creation of a strong central government. So another one of these fellows was a guy by the name of James Madison. So James Madison's background was nowhere near as colorful as the background of Alexander Hamilton. So in fact, James Madison's background was more akin to a number of these other founding fathers. So James Madison was born in Virginia in 1751. So Virginia, again, we see, like George Washington and like Thomas Jefferson. So James Madison, like these other guys, was also born into this situation of wealth and privilege. So he was born into this, plantation, and his family before him had been in this country for 3 generations. So they acquired all this land and created this plantation. They had all these slaves, in Virginia. So he was, born into the elite here. And when he became a young man, his family sent him to be educated, which was, the very few people were sent to college back then. It was the province of the elite. So he went up north. In fact, he was born in Virginia, but he went up north to college, to the College of New Jersey, which today is known as Princeton. So this was Princeton University that James Madison attended. So after Princeton, he returned back down to Virginia, and like a number of these elite people, he entered politics. So he entered the local state legislature in Virginia. So at the time, Thomas Jefferson was a towering figure in Virginia politics. So Thomas Jefferson was a number of years ahead of or older than James Madison. So Thomas Jefferson is about 8 years older than James Madison. So, and their plantations were actually pretty close to one another, so they were like neighbors. Okay, so they knew each other. So Thomas Jefferson actually identified the brilliance in James Madison. So James Madison, he was a brilliant guy. So, sort of similar to Hamilton, although in a different way. James Madison was more wonky. He's more this sort of technical guy, but he was extremely brilliant. So Jefferson recognizes this in Madison, and Jefferson takes Madison sort of under his wing. So Madison becomes sort of a protege of Jefferson, and Jefferson is sending him all these books and information, and they're discussing different forms of government throughout history, and all that sort of stuff. So James Madison develops his belief that we need a strong central government. And one of the leading factors behind his belief was he saw what was going on in the state Virginia legislature, which was the influence of special interests on these state politicians. Now, does this sound familiar? Right? I mean, this is what's going on in Congress right now, right? We hear all this about special interests and lobbyists and the influence of millionaires and billionaires on Congress, and how elections are unfair and bought, and all this political contributions, right? We need political finance reform, all of that. So that's going on today. Well, it was also what Madison was worried about over 200 years ago. So Madison's concern was he saw how these special interests in the state legislature were able to influence the politicians, and then the politicians would act in the benefit of the special interests instead of acting for the benefit for everybody. And he thought this was a big problem, because this is going to lead to government sort of rotting from inside, the corruption of government. So Madison's solution to this problem was to create an overarching federal government that was above all of this stuff, because he thought that these special interests were like local, they were regional, and they were able to influence their local politicians because of local concerns. But if you created an overarching federal government, these people would be above the local concerns and bribery that was going on, and thus an overarching federal government would be able to act in the benefit for the benefit of everybody instead of for these local special interests. So that was his solution to the problem. That was one of the reasons why he was so much in favor of creating a centralized federal government. So Madison, along with Hamilton, emerges as a central leading voice for doing something here and creating a central government and moving away from this idea of the independent states under the Articles of Confederation. So Madison is another proponent for creating a federal centralized government. So let's put Madison up on the big board. Hamilton and Madison were two leading voices in this movement of people who were trying to get together to create some sort of a central federal government. So what they wanted to do was to create a convention. So the idea was that they needed to get all these states to come together at a convention so they could then start talking about making reforms to the government. So the convention was a little bit controversial, right? The question was, were people going to attend or were they not going to attend? So the split was really that the people who wanted a brand new government, like Hamilton and Madison, they wanted to scrap the old government, scrap the Articles of Confederation and create something entirely new with a strong central federal government. Those people wanted the convention, right? Because that was the only way that you're going to be able to scrap the Articles of Confederation. However, the people who were in favor of states' rights, who wanted 13 independent nations, sovereign nations, they were skeptical of a convention because they were afraid of that is exactly what's going to happen, that if there was a convention, that there would be a movement at the convention to take away their state sovereignty and create some central federal government. So they did not want a convention. They were skeptical of the convention. So there was this movement of people like Hamilton and Madison trying to convince the people who advocated for states' rights to come to the convention. And basically what they were saying is, look at all these problems that are occurring under these Articles of Confederation. It's not working. We need to fix this. We need a better government. We need to fix it. So basically what the states' rights people said was, okay, I'll tell you what. If the purpose of this convention is just to amend the existing Articles of Confederation, just make a few tweaks here and there, then of course we're happy to come for that, because we're always happy to make some improvements or something, but it's got to be within the framework of the Articles of Confederation, because that ensures our sovereignty. Okay, so Hamilton and Madison, that's not really what they wanted, but at the same time they knew that they couldn't press too strongly. They couldn't just tell the states that that they wanted to create something new, otherwise the states would not participate. So there was a little trickery going on here, a little underhandedness of the people who wanted to create a new government weren't entirely forthcoming about their true intentions. So some people refer to this as sort of like a coup or a revolution. It was almost like overthrowing the existing government, right? The existing government was these independent 13 states, and now these people were coming along saying, no, we got to scrap that plan of the Articles of Confederation and the independent 13 states, and we have to create a new government of a central federal government. It was like a radical thing. And the way they did it was that they told the states' rights people, yeah, sure, that's fine. It'll just be to revise. So the official purpose of the convention was limited to only revising the existing Articles of Confederation. Okay, so there was a little, underhandedness sort of going on here. And this is how the Constitution was created, right? So another factor was that these people who were in favor of the convention, in favor of creating a new government, they knew that they needed the participation of George Washington. They needed to get George Washington on their side, and they needed to get George Washington to participate in this convention. Why? Because at the time, George Washington was a celebrity. He was he was like a rock star. Okay? He was super famous throughout all of the 13 states because he had just led the army that just won the Revolutionary War and that just achieved freedom for everybody in all the states. So he was this huge hero. So if George Washington came out and said, hey, this convention's a good idea and I'm going to go, then that would do a tremendous amount to encourage the entire nation to attend the convention and that this convention was a good thing. So Hamilton and Madison, as well as others, go to George Washington and they try to convince him, hey, George, dude, you've got to participate in this. You've got to come to this convention. So what was George Washington's view? So Washington, remember, he had retired after the war. He resigned his military commission and he went back to his plantation in Virginia and he retired. So he didn't really want to come out of retirement and get back into government. But at the same time, he also cared deeply about his nation, and he knew that the nation needed a strong centralized government. Because remember, he saw what it was like to try to run this federal operation of the war under the loose Articles of Confederation. He hated the Articles of Confederation, right? So he knew that the nation needed a strong central government. So what he said was, listen, I'm in favor of a strong central government, but if your purpose of this convention is just to amend the existing Articles of Confederation, just to tweak them here and there, that's not good enough. He said, so I'm not going to come. I'm not going to participate if that's all it is, because that's not worth my time and it's not worth me spending my political capital. So it's got to be, we've got to be creating something new here. Otherwise, I'm not going to participate. Okay, now this is a tricky dynamic, right? Because you can't really tell the states' rights people that it's to create something new. So George Washington understood this because he spent a lot of time talking with Hamilton, right, his friend and ally, his former assistant in the entire Revolutionary War, and talking to Madison. So Washington understood the dynamic of what was going on here. And he knew the purpose was only to revise. The official purpose was only to revise the Articles of Confederation. But what did Washington do? He agreed. He agreed to participate in the convention. Wow. This was huge, right? Every newspaper across the country had, banner headlines, Washington participating in the convention. So right away, huge segments of the population were immediately in favor of it, right? Because they were like, wow, if Washington thinks this is a good idea, well, then of course it must be a good idea. So this was huge. So Washington travels to, Philadelphia. So they decide to have this convention in Philadelphia. Okay, so Washington's traveling across the country and stopping in all these cities and whatever in favor of the the convention. So this generates a lot of publicity and a lot of positive momentum behind this convention. So all these states agree also, since the purpose is just to revise the Articles of Confederation. All these states agree. So the idea is that all the states would appoint delegates, and those delegates would then travel to Philadelphia, and they would all participate in this convention to revise the Articles of Confederation, improve our government. Of course, it turned out to be they created the Constitution, which was something entirely new. They scrapped the Articles of Confederation, ripped them up, scrapped them entirely, and created something completely new of the Constitution. But nobody knew that then. At the time, they were just people were coming to participate in this convention. Okay. But even back then at the time, there were people who were opposed to even the convention. There were people who refused to attend. So one example was Patrick Henry. So this was Patrick Henry. He was a founding father, one of the founding fathers, and he was the governor of Virginia, and he was one of the leading advocates of the Revolution. So back in 1776, when the question was whether America should break away and seek its independence and go to war against Britain, Patrick Henry was gung-ho. Yes, we've got to break away. We need our freedom. So Patrick Henry is the guy who said the famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." Okay, meaning that of course we have to fight the revolution. Either we're going to fight the revolution and either we're going to get our freedom or we're going to die trying. But it's worth dying trying because it's much better than living under this British crown. So Patrick Henry, back 11 years ago was all gung-ho in favor of the revolution. But now, 11 years later, he is totally against the Constitutional Convention. Totally against it. Why? Because he's one of these states' rights guys. He wants the states to be independent nations. He wants Virginia, his own state of Virginia, to remain a sovereign nation. And he's afraid that at this convention, they're going to create a federal government that's basically just replacing the monarchy with the federal government, and he's going to lose sovereignty for Virginia. In fact, he said, so he refused to attend the convention, and he said that he smelt a rat in Philadelphia, tending toward the monarchy. Okay, meaning he smelt a rat in Philadelphia, meaning that these people who are planning the convention are actually planning to create a new centralized federal government that will basically replace the monarchy with a federal government, and that's going to undermine the sovereignty of his state of Virginia. So pretty funny. So Patrick Henry refused to attend the convention. He wasn't the only one. Remember the state of Rhode Island? So this is Rhode Island, the state that is always objecting whenever somebody wanted to, create some sort of a unified government. Rhode Island, the entire state, refuses to attend the convention. Okay, they refuse to send any delegates to the convention. Pretty funny. So out of the 13 states, 12 of them agree to the convention. They send delegates to the convention. Rhode Island does not. Rhode Island refuses to attend, but 12 states come. So they all come to Philadelphia, to this exact same location. The exact same location, Philadelphia Independence Hall. Remember, this is the same location where only 11 years earlier, they all assembled here in the exact same place to decide whether to go to war with Britain for the Revolution. Okay, and now here they are back again 11 years later in the same place to decide how to create the new government. Okay, now that the war is over, they came here again to say, okay, now that Britain's gone, we have to figure out what we're going to do. What kind of government are we going to have? It is extraordinary. Okay, this Constitutional Convention is extraordinary. It's these people sitting in a room figuring out what our next government is going to be. It is amazing.